My friends, I want to tell you about a particular evening in my late 60s when I sat alone in my car in my own driveway for nearly 20 minutes after returning from a visit with my daughter, unable to bring myself to go inside my own house, simply because I could not yet locate the energy required to open the car door and walk through my own front hallway. I loved my daughter more than I loved almost anyone else on this earth. I had driven 2 hours to see her that day, genuinely looking forward to the visit the entire drive there. And yet I sat in that driveway afterward feeling more depleted than I had felt after any difficult conversation with a stranger or acquaintance in years. I want to be honest with you that this particular kind of exhaustion confused and troubled me deeply for a long time. I had spent my entire life believing that time with the people we love most should naturally restore and energize us, that any exhaustion following such a visit must indicate something wrong, either with the relationship itself or with my own character for feeling depleted by someone I genuinely loved so deeply. I carried a quiet, unspoken guilt about this particular exhaustion for years, telling no one, assuming I was simply failing at something that should have come naturally to a devoted father. It was only after speaking honestly with a counselor during a difficult stretch in my early 70s, and later comparing notes carefully with several close friends navigating similar family dynamics, that I finally understood something I wish someone had explained to me decades earlier. Love and energy drain are not opposites, and they are not even reliably correlated in the way I had always assumed. The very depth of our love for someone often makes us considerably more vulnerable to being drained by them, not less, precisely because love lowers our guard, deepens our investment, and makes us far more willing to give without the same careful limits we might naturally maintain with someone we cared for less deeply. The people who can drain us most thoroughly in our later years are very often not strangers or difficult acquaintances at all, but the very people whose well-being matters most intensely to us. Today I want to share with you everything I discovered during those years of honest examination, because I believe this particular confusion, between loving someone deeply and being endlessly available to absorb whatever they bring to you, causes an enormous amount of unnecessary guilt and unexamined exhaustion among people my age. This is not a lesson about loving your family less, or about withdrawing from the people who matter most to you. It is a lesson about understanding honestly why the deepest love in our lives can sometimes carry the deepest cost, and what genuine wisdom looks like in navigating this particular paradox. The first thing I understood was that the guilt I felt over being drained by my own daughter was itself part of what made the exhaustion so much heavier than it needed to be. I had spent years not only feeling depleted after our visits, but feeling deeply ashamed of this depletion, as though the exhaustion itself proved some failure in my love for her. Once I separated the plain fact of the exhaustion from the additional, unnecessary shame I had attached to it, the exhaustion itself became considerably more manageable, even before I addressed any of its actual underlying causes. The second thing I understood was that my daughter's particular struggles during that period of her life, a difficult marriage and considerable financial stress, meant that our visits had quietly become almost entirely devoted to her processing these difficulties, with very little space remaining for the lighter, more mutual connection we had once shared. I had not consciously chosen to become primarily a listening ear for her ongoing crisis, but this had gradually become the near total substance of our time together, and recognizing this pattern honestly helped me understand that the specific content of our visits, not simply the visits themselves, was largely responsible for how depleted I felt afterward. The third thing I understood was that I had never actually communicated to my daughter how these particular conversations affected me, believing instead that a good father simply absorbed whatever his child needed to share without any complaint or limit whatsoever. I had never once told her honestly that certain visits left me feeling considerably more depleted than others, assuming that voicing this would represent some failure of unconditional parental love. Learning, eventually, that honest communication about my own limits did not actually diminish my love for her in her eyes was one of the more surprising discoveries of this entire period. The fourth thing I understood was that loving someone deeply does not obligate you to serve as their primary or exclusive source of emotional support, particularly when other resources, including professional support, might serve them considerably better. I had unconsciously positioned myself as my daughter's primary confidant for every difficulty in her life, believing this reflected the depth of my devotion to her. I eventually understood that encouraging her to also seek support from a therapist, from her own friends, and from other resources was not a withdrawal of my love, but a genuinely wiser distribution of the emotional support she actually needed across several sources rather than concentrating it entirely upon me. The fifth thing I understood was that certain family members, even ones I loved as deeply as any other, seemed to consistently arrive at our visits already in a state of crisis or distress, while others arrived in a considerably calmer, more balanced state, and this difference accounted for much of the disparity in how depleted I felt following time with each of them. I began noticing, once I paid closer attention, that my exhaustion was not evenly distributed across all my family relationships, but concentrated heavily around specific individuals who consistently brought a particular intensity of need to nearly every interaction. A pattern that had nothing to do with how much I loved each person, and everything to do with the particular emotional weather each of them carried into our time together. The sixth thing I understood was that my own inability to set any limits around how much emotional labor I offered during these visits was, in fact, quietly enabling a dynamic that served neither my daughter nor myself particularly well over the long term. I discovered, somewhat uncomfortably, that my endless, uncomplaining availability may have inadvertently discouraged my daughter from developing her own resilience and other support systems, since I had always been so reliably present to absorb whatever she needed to process, regardless of the cost to my own reserves. The seventh thing I understood was that grandchildren, despite the genuine joy they brought me, could also drain considerable energy in ways I had never anticipated during my own working years when caring for children felt like an entirely different, more physically manageable undertaking. Caring for my grandchildren during their parents' busy periods, something I genuinely love doing, nonetheless required a level of physical and emotional stamina that my 70-year-old body could no longer sustain nearly as easily as it once had, and acknowledging this honestly, rather than pushing through out of pure love and obligation, allowed me to structure my caregiving in ways that were considerably more sustainable. The eighth thing I understood was that certain family members had, over many years, come to rely on me as their primary source of practical problem solving, bringing me every difficulty expecting me to help resolve it directly, rather than simply seeking my company or emotional support. I recognized, in one particular relationship, that I had become less a beloved family member and more an unpaid, always available consultant for every logistical and practical crisis that arose, gently redirecting this relationship toward more genuine, mutual connection, rather than continuous problem-solving on demand, required considerable deliberate effort but ultimately relieved a significant portion of my exhaustion. The ninth thing I understood was that spousal caregiving, even offered out of the deepest possible love, carries a genuine physical and emotional toll that deserves to be acknowledged honestly rather than minimized simply because the caregiving is motivated by love. Friends of mine caring for ailing spouses described a particular guilt at acknowledging their own exhaustion, believing that genuine love should somehow make the physical and emotional demands of caregiving effortless. Recognizing that love and exhaustion can coexist entirely honestly, without either one canceling out the other, helped several of these friends finally seek the practical support and respite care their situations genuinely required. The 10th thing I understood was that certain family members expressed love primarily through relentless worry and advice giving, and that receiving this particular expression of love, however well-intentioned, could be considerably more draining than relationships where love was expressed with a lighter, less anxious touch. A sister of mine expressed her deep love for me almost entirely through persistent worry and unsolicited advice about my health and choices, and I discovered that receiving this particular flavor of love, day after day, required a genuine ongoing effort to absorb graciously, an effort that had nothing to do with how much I valued her love itself and everything to do with its particular, exhausting expression. The 11th thing I understood was that I had spent years believing that any sign of fatigue or need for space from a beloved family member indicated some genuine weakening of my love for them, when in fact these two things were entirely separate and unrelated experiences. I eventually understood that I could love someone with my whole heart while simultaneously needing periodic distance from the intensity of our interactions, and that acknowledging this need honestly represented a far more sustainable form of love than continuing to deny it existed at all. The 12th thing I understood was that certain family gatherings, despite genuine love for everyone present, involved a level of noise, chaos, and competing demands for my attention that left me considerably more depleted than the actual duration of the gathering seemed to warrant. Recognizing this pattern allowed me to advocate for smaller, quieter versions of these gatherings when possible, or to build in deliberate recovery time immediately following larger ones, protecting my energy without diminishing my genuine love for the people involved in the slightest. The 13th thing I understood was that being the primary keeper of family peace, mediating between siblings or children who did not get along easily with one another, was consuming an enormous amount of energy that I had never properly acknowledged as its own distinct, exhausting role within the family. I discovered that I had unconsciously assumed the position of peacekeeper among several family members who struggled to communicate directly with one another, absorbing considerable emotional labor that technically belonged to their own relationships rather than mine, and gradually stepping back from their self-appointed role relieved considerable energy I had been expending largely unnoticed for years. The 14th thing I understood was that a family member's chronic negativity, even when directed at their own circumstances rather than at me personally, could still produce a considerable draining effect through the simple, repeated exposure to their persistent pessimism. A close relative of mine approached nearly every subject with a habitual negativity that, while never directed at me specifically, nonetheless left me feeling depleted after even brief exchanges, and understanding this pattern allowed me to limit my exposure more deliberately without needing to withdraw my love or care for this person entirely. The 15th thing I understood was that financial entanglement with family members, even when handled generously and without resentment on the surface, carried its own significant emotional weight that contributed to my overall depletion in ways I had not previously connected to this specific dynamic. Ongoing financial support I provided to one of my children, offered willingly and without any conscious resentment, nonetheless carried an underlying tension and worry that quietly consumed energy I had never properly attributed to this particular arrangement until I examined the pattern honestly. The 16th thing I understood was that certain family members seemed to specifically seek me out during their most difficult, crisis-driven moments, while rarely including me during their calmer, more joyful times, creating an imbalanced relationship where my role had narrowed almost entirely into crisis support. Recognizing this pattern allowed me to gently, deliberately initiate more contact during calmer periods myself, rather than continuing to experience these particular relationships almost exclusively through the lens of whatever crisis happened to be unfolding at the time. The 17th thing I understood was that my own difficulty saying no to any request from a beloved family member, regardless of my actual capacity to fulfill it well, was itself the primary driver of much of my exhaustion, rather than the requests themselves being inherently unreasonable. I discovered that most of my family members, once I finally began communicating honest limits, responded with far more understanding than I had anticipated, and that my own inability to decline requests, rather than any genuine unreasonableness on their part, had been the true source of much of my depletion all along. The 18th thing I understood was that certain family relationships required me to perform a version of emotional stability and calm reassurance that I did not always genuinely feel, and that this particular performance, sustained across decades, carried its own significant and largely unacknowledged energy cost. Serving as the calm, reassuring patriarch during every family crisis, regardless of my own genuine internal state at the time, required an ongoing performance that I had never fully recognized as separate from and considerably more exhausting than simply being present and honest about my actual feelings. The 19th thing I understood was that grief for a spouse or close family member, while representing a profound love, also created an ongoing emotional labor in caring for other family members through their own grief simultaneously, a compounding weight I had not anticipated during the actual crisis itself. Supporting my own children through their grief following their mother's passing, while simultaneously processing my own profound loss, required an emotional capacity that stretched considerably beyond what I believed myself capable of sustaining, and acknowledging this honestly, rather than insisting I could support everyone else without limit, allowed me to eventually seek my own additional support during this period. The 20th thing I understood was that I could genuinely love someone and still recognize, honestly, that a particular relationship dynamic between us was no longer sustainable in its current form, without this recognition representing any betrayal of my love for them. This distinction, between loving someone fully and accepting an unsustainable relationship dynamic without complaint, took me considerably longer to understand than any other lesson in this entire reflection, precisely because I had spent decades believing these two things were inseparable. The 21st thing I understood was that certain family members drained me most severely not through any particular crisis or demand, but through a persistent, low-grade emotional unavailability that left me working considerably harder than usual simply to sustain any genuine connection at all. A relationship with one particular family member, emotionally guarded and difficult to reach despite genuine underlying affection between us, required a kind of constant, effortful reaching that proved, over time, just as depleting as the more obviously demanding relationships in my life, if not more so. The 22nd thing I understood was that protecting my own energy around certain family relationships often required deliberate practical structures, specific time limits for visits, designated recovery time afterward, rather than relying purely on willpower or good intentions in the moment. I discovered that simply intending to maintain better limits rarely worked as effectively as building concrete structures directly into my schedule, structures that remove the need for difficult in-the-moment decisions about when a visit or conversation had reached its natural, sustainable limit. The 23rd thing I understood was that discussing this particular exhaustion honestly with trusted friends navigating similar family dynamics relieved a significant portion of the isolating guilt I had carried privately for years, discovering that this pattern was remarkably common rather than a unique personal failing. Several close friends, once I finally spoke honestly about my own exhaustion regarding beloved family members, revealed nearly identical experiences and identical guilt they had also been carrying privately, and this shared recognition alone relieved a considerable portion of the shame that had previously compounded my actual fatigue. The 24th thing I understood was that my relationship with my daughter, once I finally addressed these patterns honestly and directly with her, ultimately grew considerably closer and more mutually sustaining than it had ever been during the years when I simply absorbed everything silently without complaint. Rather than damaging our closeness, honest communication about my own limits and needs ultimately deepened our relationship into something far more genuinely reciprocal than the one-sided dynamic we had unintentionally settled into for years, teaching me that honesty about depletion, far from threatening love, often becomes the very thing that allows love to become considerably more sustainable and genuine. The 25th thing I understood was that certain family members, once they became aware of my own aging and declining stamina, gradually began adjusting their expectations of me without ever needing an explicit conversation, simply through observing my honest, visible limits rather than my old habit of concealing them entirely. I noticed that once I stopped performing endless availability and began allowing my genuine tiredness to be visible, several family members naturally adjusted how much they asked of me, without any resentment or hurt feelings on their part, suggesting that much of my old concealment had been unnecessary all along, driven by an assumption about their reactions that rarely matched their actual response once tested honestly. The 26th thing I understood was that the specific timing of family interactions mattered enormously to how depleting or restorative they ultimately felt, and that scheduling difficult conversations or demanding visits during my own naturally lower energy hours compounded their draining effect considerably. I discovered, through simple trial and observation, that conversations requiring significant emotional labor felt measurably more manageable when scheduled during my own natural morning energy peak rather than the evening hours when my reserves were already considerably depleted from the ordinary demands of the day. A simple practical adjustment that meaningfully changed my experience of even the most emotionally demanding family interactions. The 27th thing I understood was that certain family members' genuine gratitude for my support, when expressed openly and specifically, meaningfully changed how depleted I felt afterward, even when the actual support I provided remained identical in substance. I noticed that interactions where a family member paused to genuinely acknowledge and thank me for my support left me feeling considerably less depleted than functionally identical interactions where this gratitude went entirely unspoken, suggesting that acknowledgement itself carries a genuine restorative power that I had never previously recognized as a distinct, meaningful factor in my overall energy balance. The 28th thing I understood was that I had unconsciously ranked certain family relationships as more deserving of my unlimited availability than others, based largely on birth order or old family roles established decades earlier, rather than on any genuine current assessment of what each relationship actually needed or could sustainably offer in return. I recognized that I had continued treating my eldest child's requests with an almost automatic priority established when she was young and genuinely needed this level of attention, long after this old family hierarchy had stopped reflecting the actual current needs and capacities of any of my adult children. Reassessing these old assumed rankings honestly, rather than continuing to operate on decades-old defaults, allowed me to distribute my limited energy considerably more fairly and sustainably across all my relationships. And the 29th thing, the final lesson I want to leave you with today, is this: the depth of your love for someone and the depth of their capacity to drain you are not opposing forces, but frequently travel together, and understanding this honestly is the beginning of loving people sustainably rather than sacrificing yourself silently in love's name. For most of my life, I believe that genuine love should feel effortless, that any exhaustion following time with someone I love deeply must indicate some flaw either in the relationship or in my own character. I finally understood, in my 70s, that love and exhaustion can coexist entirely honestly, and that acknowledging this honestly, rather than denying it out of guilt, is what ultimately allows us to keep loving the people who matter most to us for as long as we possibly can. My friends, I want to be honest with you that acknowledging this particular truth, that the people we love most can drain us most deeply, required me to release a belief I had carried since childhood, the belief that genuine love should never come with any cost or limit whatsoever. This belief, I eventually understood, had been quietly setting me up for decades of unnecessary guilt and unaddressed exhaustion, precisely because it demanded an impossible standard that no real, sustainable human relationship could ever actually meet. I think often of that evening sitting alone in my driveway, unable to bring myself to walk into my own house after a visit with my daughter I had genuinely wanted to have. I understand now, years later, that the exhaustion I felt that evening was not evidence of any failure on my part, nor any diminishment of my love for her. It was simply an honest, physical signal that the particular way our relationship had come to operate, entirely one-sided in its emotional demands, was no longer sustainable, a signal I am grateful I eventually learned to listen to rather than continuing to override through sheer guilt and stubborn love alone. I want to share one more reflection before we close, something that took me longer to arrive at than any of the individual lessons I have already described. I have come to believe that the parents and grandparents of previous generations, my own parents included, likely experienced this same exhaustion regularly, without ever having language or permission to name it honestly. They simply endured it silently, as I did for so many decades myself, assuming it was the ordinary, unavoidable cost of love rather than a signal worth examining and addressing. I wonder now how much unnecessary suffering, across how many generations of devoted parents and grandparents, might have been eased simply by permission to say plainly, without shame, that loving someone deeply and feeling depleted by them can be entirely true at exactly the same time. If you are watching this today and you recognize, in your own life, this same particular exhaustion following time with someone you genuinely love more than almost anyone else, I want you to know that this exhaustion does not indict your love, and it does not indict theirs. It simply indicates that something about the current shape of the relationship may need honest examination and, likely, some genuine adjustment. Loving someone deeply, at this stage of life especially, requires enough honesty to acknowledge when that love has quietly become unsustainable in its current form, and enough courage to address this honestly rather than continuing to absorb the cost silently for years, as I once did myself. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I hope something I shared helps you release any unnecessary guilt you may be carrying over feeling depleted by someone you love deeply, and gives you permission to examine these particular relationships honestly, with the goal not of loving them less, but of loving them in a way that can genuinely sustain both of you for as many years as you are fortunate enough to still have together. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Love deeply, but love honestly. And trust that the people who matter most to you can withstand your honesty about your own genuine limits far better than you may currently believe. Until next time, this has been Eternal Flame Wisdom. Stay loving, stay honest, and remember, the deepest love and the deepest exhaustion can share the very same room, and naming this honestly is often the beginning of genuine, lasting peace. Thank you for watching.